Elias ben-Hanan had always been fascinated by the ancient judges of Israel. Raised in a devout Jewish family, he grew up hearing tales of Samson, not just as a biblical figure, but as a man whose downfall was as legendary as his strength. Now, as an archaeologist in his late 30s, Elias found himself standing on the dusty ground of the Sorek Valley in 1998, leading an excavation that had the potential to rewrite history. Officially, the dig was meant to study Philistine settlements in the So region, but every member of the team secretly hoped for something more, a direct link to the story of Samson and Delilah, something that could prove their existence beyond scripture and legend. For years, scholars debated whether Samson was a real person or a mythological figure, and the mention of Delilah only deepened the mystery. Unlike other biblical women, she had no lineage, no tribe, no history outside the story of betrayal. Who was she really? And why did she do what she did? These questions lingered in Elias's mind as he dusted off another piece of broken pottery, unaware that the answer was closer than he could have ever imagined. The excavation had been slow, revealing only the usual fragments of Philistine culture: decorated ceramics, crude tools, and remnants of ancient structures. The team had been working for months with little to show for it, and frustration was beginning to settle in. But everything changed on a late afternoon when one of the workers, a local Bedouin hired to assist with digging, uncovered a peculiar slab of stone. At first glance, it looked like just another piece of an old dwelling, but as they cleared the dirt away, faint inscriptions became visible on its surface. Elias immediately recognized the writing. It was Proto-Canaanite, an ancient script that predated Hebrew. His heart pounded as he carefully traced the worn letters, barely able to make out the words. The phrase repeated multiple times: D-L-L-H, Delilah. His breath caught in his throat. The name, carved in stone, was something no scholar had ever expected to find. Up until now, she had been a phantom, a shadow in the text. But this was something real, something tangible. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the excavation site, an eerie silence settled among the team. None of them spoke, but the weight of what they had just uncovered was undeniable. Elias barely noticed that he had stopped breathing. The letters on the slab were crude, worn by centuries of erosion, but unmistakable. His fingers trembled as he brushed away the remaining dust, revealing deeper grooves beneath the surface, additional inscriptions that had yet to be deciphered. The other archaeologists gathered around, murmuring in disbelief. This was impossible. No one had ever found physical evidence of Delilah outside the biblical text. Until now, she had been a whisper in history, a character who seemed to exist only within the folds of scripture. But here she was, carved into stone by an unknown hand. Elias's mind raced with questions. Who had written this? Why? And more importantly, what else lay buried beneath their feet? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert air grew colder, carrying with it an unsettling stillness. The workers, sensing something unusual, kept their distance, watching as Elias and his team carefully pried the slab from the earth. It was heavier than expected, as if the very weight of history resisted being unearthed. The stone bore no clear signs of a tomb, nor did it resemble a common monument. It felt deliberate, as if whoever had placed it there centuries ago had intended for it to remain hidden. As they lifted it, a low groan echoed beneath the ground, stone shifting against stone. The sound sent a chill through Elias's spine. Something was underneath. Beneath the slab, a narrow passageway revealed itself, framed by roughly cut limestone blocks. The entrance was no wider than a man's shoulders, descending at a steep angle into the darkness. A rush of cold air escaped from within, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something faint, yet oddly metallic. Elias hesitated. He had been on dozens of excavations, but this felt different. There was an unshakable sense that whatever lay beyond that passage had been meant to stay buried. Yet the rational part of him argued against superstition. This was a discovery of biblical proportions, literally. How could he turn back now? With a deep breath, Elias reached for his flashlight and stepped forward. The first few feet of the tunnel were tight, forcing him to crouch as he moved downward. The air grew thicker, tinged with an earthy musk that made it difficult to breathe. Behind him, the team followed cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The deeper they went, the colder it became, an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. Then, without warning, the passage opened into a chamber. The beam of Elias's flashlight swept across the walls, revealing something that made his blood run cold. Faded murals, barely visible under layers of dust and time. And at the center, staring back at him with hollow eyes, was the unmistakable figure of a woman. The mural was ancient, the pigments faded with time, yet the image remained hauntingly clear. The woman depicted was unlike any artistic representation Elias had ever seen of Delilah. She was not adorned as a seductress, nor did she wear the lavish garments often attributed to Philistine women. Instead, she stood solemn, her hands raised in what appeared to be a gesture of supplication, or was it warning? Her eyes, hollow and blackened with age, seemed to bore into Elias's soul, as if the artist had captured something beyond mere appearance. Around her, strange symbols coiled like serpents, etched into the stone with precision that suggested they were meant to endure. Elias stepped closer, his breath shallow. The more he studied the markings, the more a dreadful thought crept into his mind. This was not a tribute, it was a warning. His fingers traced the outline of the symbols, their meaning just beyond his grasp, when suddenly a voice shattered the silence. One of the team members, a linguist named Rebecca, gasped, "Elias, this isn't Philistine script." A hush fell over the group. Elias turned to Rebecca, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" he asked, though deep down he already knew this discovery was not going to fit neatly into any historical framework. Rebecca's face was pale as she pointed to a cluster of inscriptions near the mural's base. "These aren't just random symbols. They're a mix of Proto-Canaanite and something else, something much older." She hesitated, then whispered, "This predates even the earliest Hebrew writings." The weight of her words pressed upon them like the very stone surrounding them. If that was true, then this chamber was older than the time of Samson. But how could Delilah's name be here? And why would an ancient civilization, one that existed before the Philistines or Israelites, leave behind a depiction of her? The implications sent a shiver through Elias. They had stumbled upon something that defied history, something that had been deliberately hidden beneath centuries of dust and deception. But for what purpose? The silence grew heavier, thick with unspoken fears. One of the younger archaeologists, Amir, stepped forward, his voice unsteady. "Maybe we should document everything and come back in the morning," he suggested, glancing nervously at the shadows stretching across the chamber. Elias wanted to agree. Every instinct told him that staying here any longer was a mistake, but something deeper compelled him forward. He needed to understand. Ignoring the unease clawing at his chest, he adjusted his flashlight and aimed it at another section of the wall. More figures emerged from the darkness. This time, the images were grotesque. Contorted bodies, twisted faces frozen in expressions of anguish. It wasn't just a warning, it was a curse. Elias's stomach tightened. This wasn't a historical record of Delilah. It was something else entirely, something that had been meant to stay buried. And they had just disturbed it. A sudden gust of air swept through the chamber, though there was no visible source. It was subtle at first, barely more than a whisper against their skin, but then it grew. An unnatural draught, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something old, something decayed. Elias felt the hairs on his arms rise. He turned to Rebecca, who had gone rigid. Her gaze locked onto the inscriptions beneath the figures. Her lips moved soundlessly before she finally found her voice. "These words, they aren't just a record," she murmured. "They're a plea, a warning to seal the deceiver lest she walk again." The weight of her statement pressed down on the group, an unspoken horror settling into their bones. Elias's mouth went dry. Was this mural depicting Delilah as something more than a historical figure? Something far older? The logic in his mind rebelled against the thought, but his gut twisted with an undeniable truth. Whoever had carved this into the stone had feared her, not as a woman, but as something else entirely. Amir took a shaky step backward, his boots scraping against the uneven floor. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We came here looking for evidence, but this isn't history. This is myth. It's superstition." He was trying to convince himself as much as the others. Elias wanted to believe that too, but every part of this chamber defied explanation. Who were these people that had left this behind? What did they know about Delilah that the world had long since forgotten? Rebecca's hands trembled as she brushed away more dust, revealing another phrase in the stone. The moment she read it, she went pale. "She betrayed more than a man," she translated. "She betrayed the divine." A cold weight settled in Elias's stomach. The story of Samson had always been one of love and betrayal, but what if there had been something deeper, something deliberately erased from history? His pulse hammered in his ears. They needed answers. But some questions should never be asked. Then, from deep within the passage, something shifted. A sound, low and guttural, barely discernible from the silence that had swallowed them whole. It was not the groan of settling stone, nor the whisper of wind. It was something else, something that didn't belong in a place abandoned by time. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the cold emptiness of the chamber behind. The team stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their minds grasping for a rational explanation. But Elias knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that they had awoken something that had been waiting, and now it was listening. No one dared to move. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, as if the very walls of the chamber were pressing in on them. Elias felt his heartbeat hammering in his chest, loud enough that he feared whatever lurked in the darkness could hear it. His flashlight trembled slightly in his grip as he swept it across the chamber once more, searching for any logical explanation. Loose stones shifting, air escaping from some unseen crevice. But there was nothing, just the crude murals, the ancient warnings, and the suffocating weight of something unseen, something waiting. Amir swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's go. Now." No one argued. Even Rebecca, who had been the most eager to decipher the inscriptions, hesitated. It was as if an unseen force was pressing against them, urging them to leave. But Elias's gaze lingered on the mural, on the dark void where Delilah's eyes should have been. The artist had chosen to paint her differently, not with beauty or seduction, but with something far more unsettling. And for the first time, he wondered if Delilah had truly died the way history claimed, or if she had ever died at all. They turned back toward the passage, moving quickly, their footsteps crunching against the dirt-covered stone. The air seemed heavier now, as if the chamber itself resisted their departure. Elias kept glancing over his shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond the reach of their lights. But every time he turned, he saw only shadows. The tunnel stretched. Ahead of them, far longer than it had seemed when they first entered. Had it really been this deep? A tightness coiled in Elias's stomach. Something was wrong. The passage should have led them back to the surface, yet it felt as though they were descending instead. The walls seemed narrower, the air colder. Rebecca muttered something under her breath, a desperate prayer in Hebrew. Then, without warning, her flashlight flickered, And in that split second of darkness, Elias saw it. A shape, just behind Amir, a figure standing motionless in the tunnel. Panic surged through him like ice. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Rebecca's arm and shoving her forward. Amir spun around, his own flashlight swinging wildly, but the figure was gone. Only the empty tunnel remained, but they didn't wait to question it. They ran, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against their backs with every step. The tunnel twisted and turned, the path unfamiliar now, as if the structure itself had changed. The air grew, thinner, making it harder to breathe. Elias's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't dare slow down. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tunnel opened up. Cool night air rushed over them as they stumbled out onto the desert floor. The stars stretched overhead, indifferent to what had just transpired. For a long moment, none of them spoke, their breaths ragged, their minds struggling to process what had happened. But Elias knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had not left. That chamber alone. The night air should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It was too still, too quiet, as if the desert itself held its breath. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands unsteady. He turned back toward the entrance of the tunnel, half expecting to see something standing there, watching. But there was only darkness. Amir bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" he rasped, his voice raw with panic. No one answered. What could they say? That they had seen something impossible? That history had lied? That Delilah, whoever, whatever she truly was, had not been just a woman, but something far older, something buried not just by time, but by purpose? Rebecca clutched her arms, her body trembling. She had spent years deciphering dead languages, studying ancient texts, but nothing had prepared her for this. "The warning," she murmured, barely audible. "They sealed her away. They tried to erase her. But we—" She trailed off, eyes wide. With realization, they had undone something, and whatever had been kept in the dark for millennia was no longer bound by stone and earth. Elias forced himself to think logically, to push past the fear clawing at his chest. "We document everything," he said, his voice hoarse. "We don't jump to conclusions. We analyze the inscriptions, cross-reference the symbols." But even as he spoke, he knew it was useless. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was something else, something that defied categorization. The chamber, the mural, the voice in the dark, none of it fit within the boundaries of historical research. The others stared at him, their eyes reflecting the same unspoken truth. The rules of academia didn't apply here. Rebecca's flashlight flickered in her shaking hand. "Elias," she whispered, "what if we weren't supposed to find this?" The words settled over them like a funeral shroud. It was a question they should have asked before digging, before entering that tunnel, before speaking her name. Then a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, drifted from the tunnel behind them. A whisper. It wasn't wind, nor the shifting of sand. It was something deliberate. A voice, distant yet clear. One word, a name. Elias. His stomach dropped. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, to leave this place and never look back. But he couldn't move. None of them could. The weight of the night pressed against them, the stars above seeming colder, more distant than ever. And then, from the depths of the earth, from the place they had disturbed, came a second whisper. This time, it was closer. Elias. Elias's heart hammered in his chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything else. He stood frozen, unable to process the chilling reality of what was happening. The air around them had thickened, pressing down on him like a physical weight, suffocating every breath. That whisper, that unmistakable sound of his name, it was too real. It wasn't just the wind, or a figment of his imagination. It was something deliberate, something that knew him. He glanced over at Rebecca and Amir, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. They had heard it too. The same voice, the same call. Elias. The darkness around them seemed to stretch impossibly wide, swallowing up the light from their flashlights. The night had turned colder, the stars above distant and unmoving. The desert that had once felt vast and open now felt like an oppressive trap. Something had been awoken, and whatever it wasn't done yet. A sudden tremor ran through the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't the shifting of loose stones. It was something more unnatural. The desert floor groaned, as though the earth itself were reacting to the disturbance they had caused. Elias's pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Whatever they had uncovered was not something meant to be found. And it was angry. The whisper came again. This time more insistent, closer. Elias. He felt the cold sting of dread tighten in his gut, like ice spreading through his veins. The name had come from the tunnel, but now it seemed to echo from all around them, a voice that was both outside and inside their minds. There was no escaping it. They had disturbed something far older than history itself, and now it was awake. Amir was the first to break the paralysis of fear, his voice trembling with urgency. "We need to leave," he pleaded, his words barely a whisper in the oppressive stillness. His hands were shaking, his legs unsteady as he stumbled away from the entrance of the tunnel, his gaze darting back and forth like a frightened animal. "We have to go. This place, it's cursed. We shouldn't have come here." The others looked at him, but no one could argue. The terror in Amir's eyes was too real. It wasn't just fear, it was survival instinct, but Elias couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the tunnel, from the shadow that had begun to materialize there. At first it was just a vague silhouette, something out of place in the darkness, but as it stepped forward it became clearer. Delilah. But not the Delilah of the Bible. No, this was something much older, something more primal. Her eyes were black, lifeless, empty like two bottomless pits. Her skin was drawn tight against her bones, her features gaunt, distorted, as if time had twisted her into something unrecognizable. She was real, standing there in front of them, her hand extended toward them with a glint of cold metal in her grasp. A knife, old as the stones themselves, glimmered faintly in the dim light. Elias's heart raced, his mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was none. This wasn't a person. This was a force, something that had been buried for centuries, waiting for the moment when it would be freed. And now, that moment had come. Elias's legs were paralyzed with terror. He felt the urge to run, to escape, but he couldn't move. Couldn't take his eyes off the figure before him. The others were frozen too, as though they were caught in some invisible web of fear. The knife in Delilah's hand gleamed in the pale light, its edge sharp and unyielding. But it wasn't the knife that terrified him, it was her eyes. They weren't human. They were ancient. They held knowledge of something that had been forgotten, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered, though Delilah's lips didn't move. The sound was everywhere, inside their minds, filling the air like a thick fog. The words were not spoken with malice, but with the kind of inevitability that comes with something ancient and unchangeable. The wind picked up again, howling through the narrow passage, but there was no escape from the force pressing in on them. The desert stretched out before them, but it felt like it was closing in. The desert was a part of this. It had always been a part of this. The ground trembled. Again, this time more violently, as if the earth itself were alive, reacting to her presence. The otherworldly voice was everywhere now, whispering in unison with the wind. Elias. His name rang in his ears, echoing through the vast emptiness of the desert. It wasn't just a call, it was a summons. The figure of Delilah didn't chase them, didn't move from her place. She simply watched, waiting, as if time had no meaning for her. Her gaze was a promise, a warning. You cannot escape what you have. Awakened. Elias didn't look back, couldn't. He turned, grabbing Rebecca's arm and pulling her toward the jeep. Amir followed, his face a mask of fear and disbelief. But even as they ran, the sense of being pursued never left. The whispers, the tremors, the cold, they followed them, shadowing their every step. The jeep roared to life, its headlights cutting through the night like a blade, and for a brief moment they all thought they had escaped. The desert stretched before them, vast and endless. The road ahead bathed in the eerie glow of the headlights, but Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. He risked a glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Delilah standing in the distance, her dark eyes fixed on him. But there was nothing, only the empty, silent desert. The fear that had gripped them slowly began to fade, but the nagging feeling of unease remained. They had escaped, yes, but had they truly left? As the jeep bounced along the dirt road, the team fell into a heavy silence. No one spoke. The weight of what they had experienced hung between them like an unspoken truth. They had uncovered something that had been buried for millennia, something that had been hidden for a reason. What was Delilah really? A ghost? A demon? Or something far older, something that had once been human, but had transcended the very concept of mortality? They would never know, but one thing was certain. The world was no longer the same. They had uncovered something that should have remained forgotten, and now it was awake, it was watching, and it was waiting.